welcome. My name is Alistair Lane. I'm one of the ministers here at St John's in the City. It's good that you're here this evening. It's my real pleasure and privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Ted Davis. Professor Davis is in New Zealand on a Fulbright scholarship, one of the most prestigious award programs operating worldwide. Professor Davis is a distinguished scholar of history, the history of science, at Messiah College in Pennsylvania, where he teaches courses on historical and contemporary aspects of Christianity and science, and directs the Central Pennsylvania Forum for Religion and Science. But his greatest attribute is that he's the son of a Presbyterian minister. Professor Davis is known particularly for his work on the scientific revolution of the 17th century, and as a former president of the American Scientific Affiliation, who state that they are a fellowship of men and women of science and disciplines that can relate to science and who share a common fidelity to the Word of God and a commitment to integrity in the practice of science. And among Professor Davis's many accomplishments is the chapter he wrote on Isaac Newton in the recent publication Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion. And I've got an image of this book, which was published just last year. And the publishers said this about the book: if we want non-scientists and opinion makers in the press, the lab, and the pulpit to take a fresh look at the relationship between science and religion, Ronald Numbers, the editor, suggests that we must first dispense with the hoary myths that have masqueraded too long as historical truths. And I think this comment perhaps introduces something of the topic tonight, in that the relationship between science and religion is at times a tricky one, or at least is often perceived that way. Albert Einstein famously said that science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. That seems to many an extraordinarily optimistic assessment. As we know, science and religion are often perceived to be in direct conflict over the truth claims that each field wants to make. A couple of other quotes I wanted to share tonight. Martin Luther King recognised the potential for conflict between the spheres of science and religion with this quote: "Our scientific power has outrun our spiritual power. We have guided missiles and misguided men." It's when you could get away with gender-exclusive comments. The physicist Richard Feynman identified that science and religion aren't necessarily interested in the same spheres of understanding, and that expertise in one sphere doesn't necessarily transfer into another sphere. And he made this remark: a scientist looking at non-scientific problems is just as dumb as the next guy. Tonight I'm hoping that Professor Davis can help us. Maybe a historical perspective will allow us to identify the contribution that science and religion both make to humanity. I wonder if this final quote I want to show you reassures any of you. "Nothing shocks me, I'm a scientist." And this was made by none other than Indiana Jones. So we look forward tonight to what Professor Davis will share with us in his lecture titled "Darwin and Religion, Rumours of Warfare in a Post-Darwinian Age." And so I ask you to put together your hands to welcome Professor Davis. Yeah, let's actually go.
Thank you so very much, Alistair, for a wonderful welcome to the great city of Wellington, where my wife and I have never been before. We arrived mid-afternoon today. Unfortunately, we have to leave tomorrow morning because I'm going to be speaking in Christchurch tomorrow evening. And that's not going to give us much time to see the city, although we did get to wander around a little bit in the afternoon today. My wife is not in the room tonight, but if she were, this is what she would look like. She's the good-looking one. And I wanted just to mention thanks to the American government for sponsorship for this visit to New Zealand. I should also add the obvious fact that none of the people who come to any of the countries under the auspices of the Fulbright program are speaking on behalf of the American government. If we were, there wouldn't have been a budget crisis. Messiah College is a relatively small liberal arts college. For those of you who know anything about American higher education, you know there's more than 1,000 liberal arts colleges across the country, most of which predate the state university systems. Messiah College doesn't predate Pennsylvania State University. It's a little more than 100 years old. We have about 2,800 students, and we're located in Grantham, Pennsylvania, which is right about there. The only place nearby you might have heard of is Gettysburg. There was a little bit of difficulty there in the 1860s. I have a New Zealand connection, a very personal connection. The man in the left in the photograph is my great-grandfather. His name was Edward Wright. In fact, my name is Edward, and the nickname Ted is from him. He was Ted Wright. He was a young officer in the Salvation Army when William Booth sent him to New Zealand. He was one of the first two Salvation Army people to land in New Zealand. He landed in, what is the name of the port next to Dunedin? That's where he landed. And then he almost immediately came up here to Auckland, where he met Annie Brame, the daughter of John Brame, a publisher and owner of a temperance boarding house in Auckland. And his brother was one of the Albert Land settlers. Is that the name of the right group? The 1860s. That's when that group came, and that's when Annie came. She was born in England, but they met here in Auckland. They were married in the Baptist Tabernacle in Auckland 1 year before the present building was constructed. And then after they left New Zealand, she never came back. So she never saw her family again. But those are my great-grandparents. So I do have that little bit of New Zealand connection. The talk you're going to hear tonight is a slightly modified version of a talk I first gave for the Darwin Bicentennial events in November of 2009. You may well know Charles Darwin was born in February of 1809. In fact, on the very same day of the same year in which Abraham Lincoln was born. I'm not aware of a similar historical coincidence of two people of that magnitude born on exactly the same day of the same year. But in any case, in both the United States and in other countries, there have been many events, commemorative events for both or either of those two individuals. And this particular address was given to the American Academy of Religion, which ironically was not meeting in the United States that year. It was meeting in Montreal. And it was for a session on Darwin and religion, hence the title was assigned to me, Darwin and Religion. There's not going to be a lot of Darwin in the talk, but there will be a lot about science and about the influence, the alleged influence of Darwin on religion today. So let me begin the talk with 3 quotations. Here's the first. Although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Quotation from Richard Dawkins' famous book, The Blind Watchmaker. Many of you here may know the book. Second quotation from someone else who's also very famous. You probably also recognize this name, William Jennings Bryan. He was the person who was involved with the Scopes trial in 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee. He was one of the people who was on the side of the prosecution trying to convict John Scopes of teaching evolution. The fact of the matter is everyone in the room wanted a conviction, including John Scopes. If you have any questions about that afterward, I can come back to that. I'm not going to lecture about the Scopes trial tonight. It was a set trial, a show trial, in which the point was to test the constitutionality of the law itself after getting a conviction. No conviction, no test of the constitutionality of the law. Everyone hoped John Scopes would be convicted so the law itself could be tried in higher courts. Brian was there. It was the last month of his life, and he had written a number of things earlier about evolution, including in 1923 in a work called The Menace of Darwinism, which was a stump speech he gave all across the United States, trying to persuade legislators to enact laws prohibiting the teaching of evolution in publicly funded schools. And here's what he said. Theistic evolution may be described as an anesthetic which deadens the pain while the patient's religion is being gradually removed, or a way station on the highway that leads from Christian faith to no God land. I'm going to come back to Brian shortly. Third quotation is from someone you probably have not heard about, most folks at least. This is the most famous theological educator in the United States during the era of the Scopes trial, during the decade of the 1920s. This is Shaler Matthews. He was the dean of the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, which was the most influential divinity school in America at the time, maybe still is. It had the most doctoral students of any seminary, sent them out to other seminaries where they in turn taught the views of the faculty of Chicago to future Protestant ministers. In his autobiography called New Faith for Old, Shaler Matthews said this: "When Henry Ward Beecher and other liberal preachers accepted evolution, their evangelical brothers looked upon them with suspicion. Scientific method had not reached religious thought. It was only when educational processes had ceased to be controlled by the study of classical literature and grew more contemporary that orthodox theology was felt to be incompatible with intellectual integrity." Now, the quotations I have just read encapsulate the point I want to explore. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution has led many people, some of them deeply religious and some of them deeply anti-religious, to conclude that modern science is at war with religion, especially, but not only, at war with Christianity, such that believing in evolution leads almost inevitably to atheism, or at least that evolution makes traditional Christian doctrine untenable. Although Darwin himself denied that his theory was necessarily atheistical, those are the two words he used, he probably came to think that a respectful agnosticism was the best that one could do. At least, it was the best that he could do. Let each man hope and believe what he can, Darwin told the first American Darwinian, Harvard botanist Asa Gray, who was also the first theistic evolutionist of the Darwinian type. Since then, a lot of men, and many women as well, have hoped and believed what they could. And my assignment is to try to make sense of that. What then does Darwin mean for religion? More precisely, since I'm an historian rather than a theologian or a philosopher, what has Darwin been said to mean for religion? What might an historian of science have to say about this to the rest of us? Some here might know, because of in the introduction when Reverend Lane made reference to the book called Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion, he was referring to one of several books from the last 2 to 3 decades written by historians of science, people in my discipline, that have led the way in debunking a very prevalent cultural myth. The cultural myth is that science and religion have always been engaged in an ongoing, inevitable conflict, with science winning the war for cultural and epistemic territory. We call this, in my discipline, the conflict view, or the warfare view. Again, it's the idea that there's this ongoing, inevitable conflict between science and religion. It's always been that way, and it always will be that way. and that needs to guide our writing of the history of science and religion. Now, ultimately, the conflict view derives from the European Enlightenment, but its most influential expression was probably American. This is one of those cases where you can judge the books by their covers, or at least by their titles. Try this one. John William Draper was an English immigrant as a young man to the United States, and he rose up to become one of the most famous scientists of his generation. In fact, he was one of the founders of photography. He took the first photograph of the moon, in fact, back in the 1830s. In the 1870s, he was teaching at what is now called New York University, and he was no longer really too active in chemistry. He was mostly writing intellectual history, kind of amateurish intellectual history by modern standards. And in 1874, he published a work called The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. It's mostly an anti-Catholic work, but it has a grand narrative of warfare indiscriminately within the book. In 1896, the first president of Cornell University, Andrew Dickson White, who was actually an historian and a highly respected historian, published a 2-volume doorstopper of a volume like this, doorstopper of a work called A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, something he'd been working on since almost the end of the American Civil War, which was in the 1860s. It's hard to say which of these two works is actually worse in terms of the scholarship, but my vote goes to White. Although he was the first president of the American Historical Association, White seems to have consulted original sources about as often as he watched television. Consequently, his book is chock full of manufactured facts, invented or misattributed quotations, and unsupportable interpretations. I don't have time tonight to flesh that out for you, but if you want a few examples, I could come back at the end and do that. Draper is not a great deal better, yet both books remain widely influential today, perhaps because the shoddy scholarship and outright nonsense they contain is central to the apologetics of contemporary unbelief. Why else would White's contribution to historical fiction be available for free download at infidels.org, or Draper's book at positiveatheism.org? Now, much of my own scholarly work has been based on debunking the conflict view, while helping, I hope, to create a more accurate history of science and Christianity. Given this, then why have I begun this talk by quoting 3 examples that illustrate the presence of apparent conflict between science and Christian beliefs? Well, in short, because many have perceived conflict over evolution. Now, to be sure, other things have taken place which contradict the warfare view, and I'm going to come back to this at the end. But conflict has perhaps been the primary mode of interaction in this particular case. Historically, I see 4 main patterns that still govern most religious responses to evolution today. One is conflict, resulting in the rejection of evolution as valid science. The second is conflict, resulting in the outright rejection of most types of theism as contradictory to science. The third is conflict, resulting in the rejection of divine transcendence and the wholesale reformulation of traditional theological beliefs in something that looks more like a monologue to me than a dialogue, even though it's often described as the dialogue of science and religion. And finally, complementarity, in which traditional theological beliefs are upheld either by putting them into a higher realm that is separate from scientific conclusions, or else by affirming them alongside scientific conclusions, in what looks to me more like a genuine dialogue than any of the other patterns. So let's now look at a few specific examples of each of these patterns. I'm going to come back to William Jennings Bryan in a moment, and to sketch the stage for this, I need to explain to you an American word that you probably use here. But I want to tell you about the history of this word. The word is fundamentalist. And this word, even though now widely used around the world to describe various things, not all of them religious, For example, the late Stephen Jay Gould sometimes said that science, some of his scientific colleagues could be a bit fundamentalist as well. But it was originally used in a particular context, and the first use in print was in July of 1920 in a Baptist magazine called the Watchman Examiner. And the editor, Curtis Laws, used the word as a complimentary term to describe himself and like-minded friends. He was searching for a word to describe conservative Protestants who would be fighting back against what they believed to be unbiblical tendencies in what was then called modernism. Modernism was a liberal Protestant theology that already existed, that emerged in the late 19th century. Fundamentalism was a direct response to this. And the response, in the paragraph that's blown up here, unquoted partly here, he said, "We suggest that those who still cling to the great fundamentals and who mean to do battle royal for the fundamentals shall be called fundamentalists." That's the first use of this word, at least in print. This is how he described himself. By the fundamentals, he simply meant traditional Christian doctrines such as the virgin birth, the resurrection of Jesus, the inerrancy of the Bible, doctrines of this kind, the blood atonement of Christ. They were all being questioned by many modernists, and the fundamentalists didn't like that, and so they dug in their heels and wanted to do battle royal, as he says here, for the fundamentals. Issues involving science were particularly contentious at the time when this happened, coming to a head in the 1925 show trial of John Scopes that I've already referred to. William Jennings Bryan, the fundamentalist leader who assisted the prosecution, said, as I quoted above, that theistic evolution was an anesthetic which deadens the pain while the patient's religion is being gradually removed, thus shortcutting any serious attempt at productive conversation. As Bryan told the editor of a fundamentalist magazine called the Sunday School Times, evolution was, quote, "the cause of modernism and the progressive elimination of the vital truths of the Bible." And in that connection, Bryan designed this cartoon. The date here should be 1924, that's a typo. But Bryan designed this cartoon. He didn't draw it. It was drawn by Ernest James Pace, a great fundamentalist cartoonist whose monogram is here. But Bryan outlined what this cartoon would look like in a letter to the editor of the Sunday School Times, the magazine where Pace put most of his cartoons. Pace then took the idea and drew it. Bryan said, again, that evolution was the cause of modernism and the progressive elimination of the vital truths of the Bible. In his opinion, the Christian who accepted evolution would almost inevitably descend a staircase of increasing unbelief, a staircase on which, as he said, there is no stopping place short of atheism. You should see this, in other words, as a slippery slope. In this image, you see a student with a Bible in his hand, stepping from Bible not infallible to man not made in God's image. This is I'm quoting actually Bryan's description. A minister halfway down, stepping from no deity, that is no deity of Jesus, to no atonement, and a scientist at the bottom, stepping from agnosticism to atheism. And what Pace has done in the image, of course, is to play with light and shadow in a clever way, so that the student is in the light, the minister has clasped hands with the darkness, and the scientist is in the dark at the bottom of the staircase. Now, two of Bryan's concerns are illustrated in this image. His fear that evolution undermined biblical authority and thereby Christian doctrine, and his fear that evolution represented the nose of the camel of naturalism entering the tent of a religion founded on supernatural events. This latter concern is evident in another cartoon by Pace, which shows a biblical scholar wearing blinders, the assumption that miracles cannot happen, and thereby missing the evidence for Christ's miracles. This is an example of what the fundamentalists considered to be science falsely so called, a phrase taken from 1 Timothy chapter 6 that has been used, in fact, since at least the Reformation to identify various different ills as science falsely so called, starting probably with Gnosticism back in the 17th century. But by the early 20th century, it was typically evolution and naturalism that were identified as science, falsely so called. Now, Bryan also believed that evolution had led to cutthroat capitalism in America. Bryan was a very, very liberal Democrat, probably a socialist, even believed in the public ownership of banks. He just didn't live long enough to see it happen. And he also believed that chauvinistic naturalism and militarism in Germany had been strongly encouraged by the teaching of evolution in German universities, but I haven't time to sketch all that tonight. Suffice it to say that it was the religious liberals, not the fundamentalists, who were keen on eugenics and other forms of social Darwinism during the Scopes era. Now, other religious objections to evolution need to be mentioned. Charles Hodge, the leading Presbyterian theologian of the 19th century in the United States, Princeton theologian, said in 1874 that Darwinism is atheism, specifically because natural selection denies design. Philip Johnson, the founder of the modern intelligent design movement, says precisely the same thing. But even pre-Darwinian forms of evolution, forms that were clearly and deeply teleological, that is, they were orderly, they were allowed for conceptions of design, okay? Even pre-Darwinian forms of evolution were sometimes said to be atheistic and often threatening to Christianity. Like Bryan, some critics of those theories believed that biological continuity between humans and other animals threatened the image of God and undermined the basis for morality. For example, here's the man who taught Darwin geology on field trips while Darwin was an undergraduate at Cambridge. This is Adam Sedgwick. And in 1844, the Scottish publisher Robert Chambers published anonymously a work of his own called Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, which gave a pre-Darwinian teleological form of evolution, including humans. The next year, Sedgwick wrote a letter to the famous geologist Charles Lyell, in which he said this: "If the book be true, the labors of sober induction are in vain. Religion is a lie. Human law is a mass of folly and a base injustice. Morality is moonshine. Our labors for the black people of Africa were works of madmen." That's a reference to the abolition of the slave trade in England. And man and woman are only better beasts. In other words, the continuity between humans and animals for him was an issue. Not the absence of design, but the continuity. The enormously popular Scottish evangelical writer, Hugh Miller, who wrote 10,000 words a week for much of his life, saw common ancestry as a frontal assault on immortality. If humans are continuous with animals, he said, we must either hold the monstrous belief that all the vitalities, all the living things, are individually and inherently immortal and undying, or that human souls are not so. And he didn't care for that. In America, Hebrew scholar Taylor Lewis wrote that Chambers's book is atheism, blank atheism, cold, cheerless, heartless atheism, because it seemed to undermine special providence and divine moral governance of the universe. And Edward Hitchcock, the president of Amherst College, and arguably the leading geologist in America before the Civil War, had the same view. He said of Chambers's book, "We are reduced at once to materialism and atheism." Now, all of these commentators would agree entirely with Oxford zoologist Richard Dawkins if they were living today. So well known are the best-selling books by Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and others, that no one who pays attention either to the culture wars or to science and religion can possibly have missed them. Collectively, they have become known as the new atheists, and I think that is an appropriate term. Although the rejection of theism on the basis of evolution is not entirely new, I cannot think of any historical precedent for the plethora of books and articles we are now seeing, aggressively advancing what I can only call an evangelical atheism on the back of evolution. Indeed, in my opinion, this is a new form of the religion of science, a term that's been used in America since at least 1860 to mean various different kinds of things, and I'll provide a specific example a bit later. Now, of course, Dawkins denies that he's doing religion, but of course he really is. As Carl Giberson and the late Mariano Artigas have shown, Dawkins and several other scientists who write for large audiences are functioning effectively as oracles of science, offering readers precisely what religion has always offered: a creation story, a view of our place in the universe, an eschatology that is or a guide to how everything will end, and a moral guide. Now, it's not simply that Dawkins and company believe that evolution makes God obsolete, or even that the sort of God compatible with Darwinian evolution would have to be what Dawkins calls a blind watchmaker. As Terry Eagleton points out, Dawkins holds that the existence or non-existence of God is a scientific hypothesis which is open to rational demonstration. And given the conclusion that he draws, Dawkins then functions effectively as a natural theologian, the devil's chaplain, as he styles himself. For thinkers in this category, there might not be any thinkers at all in any other category, since only they are the brights. As explained by Daniel Dennett, philosopher Daniel Dennett says, what is a bright? A bright is a person with a naturalist as opposed to a supernaturalist worldview. We brights don't believe in ghosts or elves or the Easter Bunny or God. Now, the views of the new atheists are what most scholars probably have in mind when they speak of the warfare of science and religion. Their particular version of the warfare view is more virulent, more vociferous than the version of A. Draper and White, which was much subtler and gentler, and therefore it's more readily visible. Yet I think it is White's version that has actually been far more influential on the modern dialogue, despite the fact that its subtler posture has not really been much gentler in its effect on traditional beliefs. I'll explain White's agenda in a moment, but I want to show you where I'm coming from on this, on interpreting him, by drawing a comment from the late Stephen Jay Gould. Gould understood, better than most others today, precisely what White was really about. As Gould said, White did not formulate his thesis about warfare between religion and science primarily to advance the cause of science, but rather to save religion from its own internal enemies. Its own internal enemies were what White believed to be, and Gould agreed with White on this. White identified those internal enemies as, quote, dogmatic theology. The adjective dogmatic in White's book is always a bad word. It's like the word medieval. It's a bad word in White's book. It's just a pejorative term for traditional Christian beliefs. You know, Gould was right. White did not want science completely to eradicate religion, as Dawkins wants. A careful reading of the title of White's book indicates this. It was A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. Theology is the bogeyman here. White wanted only to see the ice of dogmatic theology melt inexorably away into the mighty river of advancing scientific knowledge, in order that the truth of religion, the moral truth, could survive. That memorable image of the ice in the river comes from the flowery preface that White wrote for his book, which he finished while he was the American ambassador to Tsarist Russia in the early 1890s and was housed in the legation in St. Petersburg on the river Neva. Listen carefully to this image, because I'm going to tell you exactly what White meant by this. There is St. Petersburg with the Neva in the winter. And you have these ice dams that form in the spring as it melts that are a great danger to everything downstream. My book is ready for the printer, and as I begin this preface, my eye lights upon the crowd of Russian peasants at work on the Neva under my windows. With pick and shovel, they're letting the rays of the April sun into the great ice barrier which binds together the modern quays and the old granite fortress where lie the bones of the Romanov Tsars. Now, those two sentences sound like they came right out of a novel, but of course this is purportedly a work of serious historical scholarship. This barrier is already weakened. It is widely decayed, in many places thin, and everywhere treacherous. But it is, as a whole, so broad, so crystallized about old boulders, so embedded in shallows, so wedged into crannies on either shore, that it is a great danger. The waters from thousands of swollen streamlets above are pressing behind it. Wreckage and refuse are piling up against it. Everyone knows that it must yield. But there is danger that it may resist the pressure too long and break suddenly, wrenching even the granite quays from their foundations, bringing desolation to a vast population, and leaving, after the subsidence of the flood, a widespread residue of slime, a fertile breeding bed for the germs of disease. Okay, there's 2 shorter paragraphs to go, but I want to make sure that we're on the same page with this. The metaphor that White is using here, in that metaphor of the ice and the river, the ice is Christian theology, and the river is science. The patient moujiks, the serfs, the patient moujiks are doing the right thing. The barrier, exposed more and more to the warmth of spring by the scores of channels they're making, will break away gradually, and the river will flow on, beneficent and beautiful. My work in this book is like that of the Russian moujik on the Neva. I simply try to aid in letting the light of historical truth into that decaying mass of outworn thought which attaches the modern world to medieval conceptions of Christianity. There's that pejorative. And which still lingers among us, a most serious barrier to religion and morals, and a menace to the whole evolution of society. So, consistently with the progressive ideas of the late 19th century, in which science is the source of progress, the primary source of progress, and traditional theology is only a negative force, only obstructive, holding it back, White paints this entire picture of Christianity and science in this way. We now know, that is, we historians of science and religion now know, that White could hold such a view only by constructing a false history of Christianity and science. Yet his influence on subsequent thinkers has been profound. Even those thinkers who deny that science and religion are engaged in an ongoing, inevitable conflict often agree with the warfare view as White understood it, namely that traditional theology has proved utterly unable to engage science in fruitful conversation, and therefore we must now reformulate our theological understanding in order to fully embrace modern science. Recall what Shaler Matthews said about the impact of science on religion in the quotation I read at the start of my talk. Orthodox theology was felt to be incompatible with intellectual integrity, that general attitude. Matthews represented the modernist wing of Protestantism and the most influential part of that wing, and that was his assessment. Now, Matthews was a member of the Hyde Park Baptist Church near the University of Chicago on the south side of Chicago. It's now Hyde Park Union Church. His fellow member, philosopher and intellectual historian Edwin Arthur Burt, who signed the Humanist Manifesto of 1933 and was perhaps not a theist at all, commented sharply on the views of his colleagues. I really have to hear him talking to Matthews in the book he wrote in 1930 called Religion in an Age of Science. Considering the historical conflict of religion and science, Burt wrote, here's what he said: "How much can I still believe is the question pathetically asked. Beginning with 200 or more doctrinal articles, there ensues a process of elimination and attenuation till today, in liberal circles, the minimum creed seems to have been reduced to 3 tenets: belief in God, confidence in immortality, and conviction of spiritual uniqueness in Jesus of Nazareth. Thus, the pathetic game of give what must, hold what can, continues." That's Burt's assessment of what he saw going on around him. Now, all of this resonates with the conclusions of Princeton embryologist Edwin Grant Conklin, who was a leading public intellectual in the United States before World War II. Here you see him on the cover of Time magazine in the late 1930s, our most famous news magazine. You don't get on the cover of this without doing something, at least. Now, Conklin was incidentally hired at Princeton before World War I by Princeton President Woodrow Wilson, who later became president of something else. Conklin saw his own spiritual journey as one that Orthodox friends, he said, might interpret as descending steps, leading him further from the Methodist faith of his youth, as he slowly gave up his Christian beliefs in the acceptance of scientific naturalism. It's impossible for me to read what he writes there without thinking of that staircase of William Jennings Bryan. Conklin fit it. My gradual loss of faith in many Orthodox beliefs, he recalled near the end of his life, came inevitably with increasing knowledge of nature and growth of a critical sense. Especially important in this regard was his reading of White and Draper. These books, he said, showed the impossibility of harmonizing many traditional doctrines of theology with the demonstrations of modern science. That is, that's how he thought White and Draper did, and he completely bought their version of warfare. Thus, for him, it was no longer possible to be religious in a traditional sense. And so, when he lectured a Philadelphia audience on the religion of science in the mid-1920s, he identified the essential contents of his faith in these notes. We don't have the text of the address, but it may not have been one. He may just have preached, he may have spoken from these notes. The religion of science is very different from the religion of tradition and revelation. It has no personal God, no miracles, no supernatural revelation, no personal immortality, no ghosts, witches, demons, no blood atonement, no propitiation of an angry God, no objective efficacy of prayer, and something else that slipped out of his mind. Now let me skip a couple slides here. In light of the examples just offered, it's not hard to agree with Ian Barber's observation. Ian Barber is the sort of granddaddy of all the modern scholars of science and religion. Without him, there would be no such academic field at all. Ian Barber's observation that the modernists, as he said, emphasized God's immanence, often to the virtual exclusion of transcendence. And in some cases, God was viewed as a force within a cosmic process that was itself divine. Yet the views and attitudes of these modernists, namely, that which isn't scientific ought no longer to be affirmed by the Christian theologian, would fit perfectly into the intellectual world of 2011. As David Ray Griffin has noted, modern liberal theologies have achieved a reconciliation of science with theology at the expense of its religious content. Thus, when the late Arthur Peacock spoke of God as the transcendent yet immanent creator, he did not mean the maker of heaven and earth who literally became flesh in the person of Jesus Christ, born of a virgin and raised bodily from the grave. Or when Catholic theologian John Haught testified at the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial a few years ago, he declined to affirm the historicity of the resurrection. If the disciples had brought a video camera into the upper room, it would not have captured an image of the risen Christ. The camera lacked faith, apparently, and therefore it could not see. Now, not everyone has fallen victim to this type of warfare thinking, the white warfare thinking. John Polkinghorne has seen perhaps more clearly than anyone else the ongoing influence of White's attitude in modern theology. The scientific avenue into theological thinking, he's written, will seek to give due weight to science, but it would be fatal to allow it to become a scientific takeover bid, affording no more than a religious gloss on a basically naturalistic account. Polkinghorne is, as many of you may know, is an Englishman who is also an Anglican priest and a physicist. He gave up his career in physics at the age of 49, which was some time ago, since he's now 81, in order to enter the Anglican ministry. And subsequently, he has written a number of books, more than 30 actually, about science and Christianity. So he had these two careers. His career at Cambridge was, of course, as a colleague of people like Stephen Hawking. Just a little bit about his scientific background. After he finished an undergraduate degree in applied maths at Cambridge, which is what theoretical physicists do when they go to Cambridge, he stayed on for doctoral work where his doctoral mentor was the first Islamic scientist to receive a Nobel Prize, namely Abdus Salam, a Pakistani physicist. And he then had did postdoctoral work at Caltech in Pasadena, California, with Murray Gell-Mann, a Nobel Prize winner also, who is the founder of quark theory. Polkinghorne's expertise is related to quark theory. Now, for Polkinghorne, the key to understanding him, I think, and how he would approach the science-religion issue, and rather differently from any of these other ones we've seen, is in the claim that science cannot provide its own metaphysical interpretation. He wants to make a sharp distinction between physics, the world as we find it, and metaphysics, the larger meanings that we apply to it. As he has said, physics constrains metaphysics, but no more determines it than the foundations of a house determine the precise form of the building erected on it. So there's a conversation here, but physics can't build the rest of that house. It can simply build the foundation. Science, he says, offers an illuminating context within which much theological reflection can take place. But in its turn, it needs to be considered in the wider and deeper context of intelligibility that a belief in God affords. I'll come back and explain what he means by that in a moment. As he said, the universe is not only rationally transparent to us, that is, we can not only understand it with our minds, but it is also rationally beautiful, rewarding those who investigate it with the experience of wonder at what is disclosed to their inquiry. If you want to understand Polkinghorne, you need to understand both of those quotations. Perhaps an easy way to sum up where he's going is to look at three famous statements by modern physicists, none of whom, to the best of my knowledge, was a very strong religious believer. I'll start with Albert Einstein. A very famous statement of Einstein's, translated in various ways. I like this translation. The most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it is comprehensible. In other words, it's really hard to understand why the world makes any sense at all. That's where Einstein was coming from with this comment. Why does the world make sense? A second comment from Hungarian mathematician and physicist Eugene Wigner. This comes from an essay called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. If you look this one up online, you'll easily find it. It's a fascinating essay. The question Wigner's concerned with is in bold at the bottom here. Why is mathematics so powerful for understanding nature, even down deep? Why is it so powerful? It's not just a trivial understanding of the world we get this way. And when he responds to this, his comment is, it's difficult to avoid the impression that a miracle confronts us here, quite comparable in its striking nature to the two miracles of the existence of laws of nature and of the human mind's capacity to divine them. And the third piece, which Polkinghorne also picks up on, is this. A quotation from his own professor at Cambridge, Paul Dirac, whom he described once as the greatest English theoretical physicist of the 20th century. I would agree with that assessment. And then Dirac said this once. God used beautiful mathematics in creating the world. This result is too beautiful to be false. It is more important to have beauty in one's equations than to have them fit experiment. So this is similar to Keats's, is it Keats or Shelley who said, beauty is truth and truth is beauty? I sometimes confuse those two fellows, but you all know the quotation. Beautiful mathematics is something I can't detail for you tonight, but there is a shared intersubjectivity among mathematicians and physicists about what a beautiful equation is. There's a pretty wide agreement on it. When they see an equation, they'll say, that's beautiful. Another one, they'll say, that's not. And, like artists acquire certain senses of beauty, so do mathematicians. Those are the equations you need to understand nature, the ones that mathematicians regard as beautiful, not just any ordinary equation coming down the road. So why is it the case? Why is it the case that nature makes sense? Why is it the case that mathematics is so powerful in this regard? And why is it this particular kind of mathematics that we really need? Those are the kinds of questions that Polkinghorne is interested in, for which he believes that theism gives the best response. But he doesn't leave it there. He continues on to simply to say, concerning Christianity now, not just theism, as he points out, the resurrection is the pivot on which Christian belief turns. Without it, it seems to me that the story of Jesus' life and its continuing aftermath is not fully intelligible. In his book, The Faith of a Physicist, which is a commentary on the Nicene Creed, Polkinghorne devotes most of a chapter to exploring whether the belief that God raised Jesus from the dead is one that is credible for us today. Along the way, he rejects the view associated with Rudolf Bultmann that what happened was only a faith event in the minds of the disciples. And Polkinghorne goes on then to place the source of doubt where it actually belongs, not in science itself, but in the skepticism of Enlightenment philosopher David Hume, who, as Polkinghorne said, whose confidence that the laws of nature were known with a certainty that extends even into realms of unprecedented and hitherto unexplored phenomena is one that was certainly falsified by the history of science subsequent to the 18th century. And it could never be pressed to dispose of an event like the resurrection of Jesus, which claims to be a particular act of God in a unique circumstance. I close now with a paradox. Polkinghorne is a modern thinker, but pre-modern enough to appreciate postmodern efforts to demythologize science without embracing complete relativism. In my opinion, he understands better than most other contemporary theologians what my discipline, the history and philosophy of science, has done for theology. He not only understands, as many others do, that the warfare model that was uncritically accepted for most of the 20th century is historically bankrupt. He also understands that this negates the pseudo-historical underpinning of many modern efforts to demythologize theology in the name of science. Above all, he realizes that one of the most serious consequences of the modern embrace of White's attitude, namely the flight from transcendence, has left theology unable adequately to ground Christian hope and less able to converse productively with science as a partner of equal standing. And in identifying philosopher David Hume, rather than scientist Charles Darwin as the bogeyman, Polkinghorne advances a more helpful conversation between science and religion. Thank you for the opportunity to share these comments with you.
Well, thank you, Professor Davis. There's a fascinating exploration of what has been said and identifying those categories and shaping what you've shared with us under those categories. Fascinating indeed. Professor Davis is happy to take questions, and so we'll indulge that for a spell. I don't want us to be here too late tonight, but so if you do have a question that you'd like to ask Professor Davis, then if you wouldn't mind standing and speaking nice and loudly for us all to hear, that would be great. Jonathan. Thank you.
The fact of the matter remains that
Well, you touched on two issues, two really small issues, one of them having evolution, the other one global warming. Concerning the latter, by the way, it's taken me a long time to figure out what the religious opposition really is to that issue. I think substantially that's a political thing, much more than a religious thing. There are religious statements made against it, but I think the overwhelming majority of the opposition there has to do with politics rather than religion directly. And the connection between conservative politics and conservative religion in America has been strong since the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision about abortion, something like 40 years ago. So that's all I will say about that part. Now, the evolution part, I'll start simply by saying that probably the two most widely influential anti-evolutionists in the United States right now are from down under. One is Ken Ham. He's certainly the most influential. He's Australian. He directs the Answers in Genesis, which owns the Creation Museum near Cincinnati, but he's not an American. And the second is Jonathan Sarfati, a former national chess champion from New Zealand. And he's one of the writers he's been one of the writers for Ken Ham for some time, although I think he's now gone back to down under somewhere, either here or over in Australia. Nevertheless, having said that, which is true, let me say that I think opposition to evolution is much stronger than it is in other places, partly because Americans have a tradition of common sense realism, thinking for themselves and drawing their own conclusions about things and thinking they are as smart as the experts. And in an issue like evolution, which is hardly demonstrable in an obvious, simple way, I mean, the macro theory of evolution is what I'm talking about. You know, you don't every day see dogs evolving into cats or fleas or something else. People don't see the evidence for evolution in front of them, and they're very skeptical about the historical sciences, in which it's difficult or impossible to do direct experimental tests of claims. And so that kind of deep-seated skepticism on the part of Americans goes hand in hand, I think, with conservative religion in many cases. There's an emphasis on the facts, the hard facts, rather than upon speculative hypotheses. Let me just show you a slide from a different talk, if I can get it on here to load. Here's another one of Ernest Pace's cartoons. This one's from June 1922. This is when William Jennings Bryan and the anti-evolution campaign were really getting off the ground. And this particular balloon is no longer getting off the ground, as you can see in this cartoon. Here, the Darwinian hypothesis of evolution is shown to be badly leaking and headed for Earth. It's headed for a collision with the facts. And it's coming out of speculation in the clouds. And the gondola is another example of science falsely so-called. We saw that with biblical scholarship in a slide in the other lecture. Here it would be evolution. The word hypothesis is crucial here for understanding this view. In William Jennings Bryan's opinion, a hypothesis is a fancy word for guess. And evolution is just guesses strung together. And it's not worthy of belief, in Bryan's opinion. There's a very widespread resistance to belief in this type of science in the American public. And I'm not so sure this is entirely confined to the American public either. I have seen some recent opinion polls showing that roughly half of Canadians and roughly half of the people in the United Kingdom are very skeptical of evolution as well. And so I think it's much, this resistance to belief in to accepting a hypothesis of evolution as valid science is not simply American. But in America, there's a bigger religious piece to go along with it, because Americans, by and large, are more religious than people in other countries in the modern West. So certainly in New Zealand, which I understand is perhaps the least religious country in all the West, of all the Western-oriented nations, right? Something like 4% of the New Zealand population is at least active Christians.
Yeah, it depends
how you define it, right, yeah. Right, something like that, in America, it's going to be at least in the decades, percentage. I don't know what a recent measurement would be, but it would have to be 30, 40, 50%, something like that. Whereas in New Zealand, it's a fraction of that. So I think the two factors together are working behind this. It's not simply a religious factor. There's also this deep-seated unbelief in speculative hypotheses. The historical sciences generally are rejected by creationists in the young Earth creation sense. Not simply evolutionary biology, but also paleontology and the Big Bang and cosmology. The Big Bang is something lots of conservative Christians like in the United States, but scientific creationists don't like it.
So, just to carry that a little bit further, is it fair to say that you would say that the skepticism around some of the evolutionary science isn't restricted to religious, religiously motivated thinking?
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, this is a question of people feel they're unpersuaded by the evidence that evolution is too speculative. Sometimes people refer to this as a kind of Baconianism, a reference to Francis Bacon. There is in the United States a long tradition of what we call the common sense tradition, the Scottish common sense tradition coming out of Thomas Reid in the 18th century, which has a big influence on 19th century American thinking. In a common sense realist approach, if you can't show it, you shouldn't believe it. It's a hard-headed empiricism. And in the opinion in this tradition, many would say, evolution goes beyond what you can simply show. It's too speculative. I'm not convinced. That's what many Americans would say.
Thank you. I suspect Jonathan may see a link with some of the climate change denial as well in that regard. Richard.
Symbolic truths and perhaps more literal truths, as one might find, for example, with the virgin birth. So that there is a debate about whether the true believer has a literal view of things, whereas anyone who has a more symbolic interpretation has somehow drifted from the track. I feel that very often you can hold literal interpretations and totally miss the much deeper, profound truth of what some of our doctrines do. So I found it hard to see the places where Christianity was identified with the traditional view as compared, say, with the symbolic interpretation. And those are not mutually exclusive either, I know that. I think the other thing too is, there never, in all these debates, which I've followed quite extensively over many years now, it seemed that there's never any question about our images of God. And I think that our traditional images of God are largely anthropomorphically driven. And once you add concepts of eternity to anthropomorphism, then you've got to find a place now for God in the physical startup of the universe. And I wonder if we get to that point, and so much of our conflict with science, I don't see it as a conflict at all, but actually derives from a literal interpretation of an responsibility is stewardship for the creation as we know it. But whether we hold on to those things, which for me are quite central and essential, but we don't have to get locked into an anthropomorphism, which throws up a whole lot of problems, such as we're endlessly debating about for years.
Thanks, Richard. Any other comments or questions?
Good evening, everybody. Professor, what happened to Darwin as he got older? Did some of his views change and coming closer to his death? Did things change with what he had previously believed strongly through his time and his studies?
The question is about any changes in Darwin's own views. I take it this is a reference to Darwin's religious views, or do you mean also to his science?
Both, if possible.
Well, there's a common story which is almost certainly false, that Darwin repented of evolution on his deathbed. In fact, that's one of the myths dealt with in that book, Galileo Goes to Jail, and other myths about science and religion. Perhaps that was in the back of your mind in the question. But as regard to Darwin's religious beliefs, there's quite a bit of disagreement on how exactly to interpret the history of his evolution, if you will, in his religious beliefs. As far as I'm not a Darwin expert, although I read a lot of the Darwin experts and I know several of them. There seems to be wide agreement on the endpoints of Darwin's religious faith. One, that until he was roughly 26, 27 years old, he was a traditional Christian believer. In fact, when he considered becoming an Anglican minister, which is partly behind his transfer from Edinburgh to Cambridge as an undergraduate student, he had some hesitation about some of the 39 articles of the church, but he didn't seem to have any hesitations about the basic ideas of Christianity. Even though he'd been raised in a free-thinking family, his father was never a Christian, neither was his grandfather. And as for the other end point, at the time of his death, he very clearly viewed himself as an agnostic. That's a term that had been invented by his friend Thomas Huxley, and Darwin didn't hesitate to apply it to himself in his latter years. So those two endpoints seem really clear. When did transitions happen? What were the causes of those transitions? That's where the Darwinian scholarship doesn't have a single conclusion. My own view, and again I caution you, I'm not a Darwin expert, but my own view from reading the experts, the one that makes the most sense to me, is that he began to have doubts about the literal truth of a number of Bible passages, even in his mid-20s. This is before he was thinking about evolution. As he began to work out the theory of evolution in the late 1830s, this is when he was almost 30 years old, he was also having more doubts about the literal truth of the Bible. When he first wrote out his theory of evolution in 1842, and then in a longer version in 1844, which is when he was 33 and 35 years old, at those times, he was essentially thinking in a deistic way about the creation. He was not thinking in a non-theistic way. He was thinking in a rather deistic way. And those versions of evolutionary theory still survive, and historians have pored over them. They're in manuscript in Cambridge University Library. When the theory was finally published in 1859, that's 15 years after the longer version of the theory was out, he was almost certainly at that point very close to agnosticism, if not a full agnostic at that point. But the theory had been substantially written between 15 and 20 years earlier, at a time when he was very clearly a theist of a sort. So somewhere in there, a big event was undoubtedly the death of his father, when Darwin was around 40, and the death of his favorite daughter, Annie, when he was 42, and probably of tuberculosis. And he nursed her himself through this ailment because his wife was in an advanced state of pregnancy, and he went with Annie to healing baths and such places, wrote these heartbreaking letters back home to his wife about this, watching her slip away from him. And this is the time probably when he lost what was left of his Christian beliefs. It was because probably of the death of his father, whom he viewed as a man now damned for eternity. And he then says at this point, damnation is a damnable doctrine. And then the loss of his daughter a couple of years later. So there's a confluence of different things. Sorry for the long answer, but it's a complicated thing. You know, it's a story of a person's life and the story of their belief. Science has a role in it, probably not the primary role in the story of the change of Darwin's beliefs.
Got a quick question. Anne Burstall, thank you very much, Professor, for your lecture. My question relates to moving forward from science and religion where we're at now. I was raised in a very Christian Baptist setting. I'm pleased that I've got the morals of that and the mythology that I've taken from it in a non-Christian active participant sense. But I think that the scientists need to have mythology. They need a narrative. They need meaning beyond science, which you can't offer them. And Christianity, I don't see as a literal story to take the Bible as fact, but I see the value in it in terms of a meaning-making mythology. So do you think that science and religion could come together and have a fusion, not necessarily a religious fusion per se, but a fusion of accepting beliefs, accepting ways forward?
Say that again about science having a fusion.
Well, maybe not fusion, but coming to an honest position where we understand we need myth and to debunk other people's myths at the expense of their meaning structures is not cohesive.
Yeah, well, I do think that there are a number of scientists who are writing for the general public who are in the process of myth-making to some extent. And so I think that it's true that science doesn't itself provide myth to round itself out, but many scientists will do this in their writings, just as people who are not scientists will do this as well. An example of a couple of scientists who do this, one would be Carl Sagan, the late Carl Sagan, arguably the most famous American scientist of his generation, not because he was a great scientist. He was a very good one. Whether he was a great one is not clear, but because of his reputation worldwide. He was always on media, like he used to be on the Johnny Carson show, for those of you who, you know, the American Tonight program with Johnny Carson. He was on regularly. He did a PBS television series for 13 weeks called Cosmos in the late 60s or early 70s that has been viewed by millions and millions of people, and in which he gives a religious interpretation to the universe. And of course, he even wrote novels, one of which was made into a major film, Contact. You know, the one film with Matthew McConaughey and Jodie Foster. That was a Carl Sagan novel this was based on. Sagan could probably be considered a pantheist. He might not have recognized that himself. He might not have seen himself that way, but you might be able to see him that way, as someone who almost divinized the universe to get his meaning from the universe itself, his sense of wonder and awe, his sense of what's morally right and wrong from the universe itself. He would be an example of someone who's done this. There's others who've done it as well. Now, I think that Dawkins would be very swift to deny what I said about him tonight, namely that he's engaged in making a kind of religion. He would be vociferous, I think, against that, but I would disagree with him. I think he really is in the business of trying to place values onto science by saying, you know, science tells us, for example, that there's no transcendent realm, or science tells us that our past is from evolution and our genes are serving themselves, and this is how we got here. You know, the idea of the selfish gene, that organisms exist only to serve the needs of the gene. Things of this nature. He does tell us, I think, about ultimate meaning or the absence of that as a kind of religious message. I think he has to recognize that, even if he won't say that he's really doing a kind of irreligion on this basis. So I think it is indeed something scientists are going to do. They're going to give religious meanings. Now, what kind? Well, science isn't going to tell you that. The science is not going to tell you what meaning it's going to give you, in my opinion. Those are going to be like a value-added tax. So the meanings that we bring into the science are going to be from somewhere else that we're going to use to interpret it.
Professor Davis mentioned to me beforehand that he considers the best part of these evenings to be the question time. I might disagree with that, but we will stop there, I think, and let me express on your behalf, again, our thanks to you, Professor Davis, for travelling all this way and sharing with us your insights and your expertise in the area of the history of science. I think I say this without any royalties being attributed to me at all, but I will make a plug for the book because I think that if we want to hear more about what we've heard tonight, it sounds like that book that you've contributed to, Galileo Goes to Jail, etc., would be a good one for us to read. So we want you to take something away with you. A little bit of New Zealand, and as an expression of our thanks. And again, I ask you to show your appreciation for Professor Davis.
Yeah. Oh, it's really beautiful. I won't unwrap it further because I don't want to. I want to be able to leave it wrapped up like this. But it's a fern, right?
That's right.
Yeah, it's a beautiful metal fern.
That's silver, yeah.
Silver.
Well, it's not
yeah.
really silver,
But
I wish I could say that. It's a very strong symbol of the victory that New Zealand will demonstrate at the World Cup.
Well, one of my great regrets about this trip is that it's mistimed. I'm not going to be able to see any of the World Cup games.
They don't broadcast it in the United States.
Well, they probably do on some obscure channel somewhere.
Yeah.
But with Polkinghorne, one of the things I agree with Polkinghorne on is that rugby is an excellent game, much better than American football, which stops every time it starts to get interesting.
Very good.
So,
very good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Professor, and we wish you well for the rest of your time in New Zealand and your return back to the United States.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming tonight.
Very good. Quinn, did you want to come?
Well, this is a shameless plug. I'll go over here. You can probably hear me from one of the slides from here. You'll know that it's the 400th anniversary this year of the publication of the King James Bible. What you may not know is that the principal celebration in New Zealand will be the one that's held here in Wellington on the final weekend of this month. We've been very kindly treated by Chris Finlayson, the Minister of Arts, Culture and Heritage, who has given us the use of the Beehive Theatre for the day. And we've assembled a program of 6 papers and some interludes. Is Professor of English at Vic, but he happens to be the gold standard of scholarship on the King James Bible. And over the past 10 years, he has identified and corrected, rather in the way that you might restore an old master, he has restored the text to what was there in 1611. If you have a loose $1,200, you can get in 2 volumes from the Folio Society the edition which has been published on the basis of his work. If you have rather less, there's a commentary volume which I came across in the London Review of Books, and that only costs £15. Our own Chris Marshall is going to talk about the reading of a pre-modern Bible in a postmodern world. And Andrew Bradstock, who's a professor of theology and public issues at Otago, is going to talk about the Bible in the public square. Now, interspersed among these, we have contributions from Robert Easting and Christine Franzen, who understand the development of language. And they are going to use as their experimental model, if you like, the evolution of the words of the Lord's Prayer from 380 to 1611 AD. But Robert will also read certain passages from the King James Bible in the Jacobean speech in which it was used when it first came into existence. And one of his contributions will be the first chapter of John's Gospel. After lunch, I'm talking about King James himself, because if you don't understand, and 400 years of historians have failed to for the most part, if you don't understand the disability under which James laboured, you can't measure his achievement. Peter Lynham from Massey Campus in Auckland will talk about the Bible in New Zealand over 2 centuries. And finally, Graham Redding returns to town to talk about the Bible as a study in truth and beauty. And you'll remember in that reading from John's Gospel that John talks about, we beheld his glory, as it were, of the Father, full of grace and truth, which of course is the motto of Knox College, where Graham is based these days. After all that heavy work, we go upstairs to the Grand Hall for a cocktail reception where there will be historic Bibles on display and indeed some leaves from a 1611 edition. We then go through into the legislative chamber for a recital of Jacobean music by the Tudor consort and return to the Grand Hall in time for dinner, which is being hosted by the minister. So much for the Saturday. The survivors have the prospect on the Sunday morning of attending a morning service here, which will pay due homage to the King James Version, and at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, a special musical program at the cathedral. Now, for those 2 Sunday observances, and I'll tell you in a minute why this is the Sunday that's been chosen, those 2, you put your money in the plate. But if you want to register for Saturday, you do it through the St John's website, and the fee for the whole day, including the dinner, is $180. Now, why this weekend, this final weekend of August? If I tell you that Sunday the 28th of August is the feast of St Augustine in those churches that have saints' days. St Augustine, you remember, was the Bishop of Hippo. He was the one who invited in one of his prayers that the Lord would make him chaste and all sorts of other things, but not just yet. Now, Augustine had a very penetrating understanding, and he has become the patron saint of theologians and printers. And so what better day in the church's year could there be to base a celebration like this around? I hope you'll all be there. Thank you.
Thank you, Wyn. It's our pleasure to invite you to stick around for some supper. You would have heard the clinking of trolleys in the foyer, so you're most welcome to do that. And I understand Professor Davis is going to be around for the supper as well. So if you would like to ask him anything, do feel free to take advantage of that opportunity. So thank you all for being here tonight, and God bless.